I want to introduce to you Matthew Warshaw of D3 Systems and Gary Langer of ABC News. Thanks for being with us.
Absolutely.
We are just starting off interviewing folks at AAPOR about their research, and you all did some fantastic research in Afghanistan. It's very difficult to do research in a conflict zone. Could you tell us a little bit about the difficulties that you encountered in conducting this research?
Well, the main obstacle for us is always logistics in Afghanistan. It's a very big country. It's hard to organize the field work. We had to cover 34 provinces. Some places were desert-like, some places were mountains loaded with snow. It's very hard to move the interviewing staff around to these places, and to get the interviews done for the project, it required a massive effort to coordinate the people, and frankly a very brave Afghan interviewing staff to not only take on the elements, but take on the current security situation in Afghanistan.
What do you think are some of the trends that stand out the most to you in looking at the data from the research you've conducted over the last 5 years?
Well, I think the essential element indeed of our research is to be able to look at the trends over time. We started out with enormous support for the United States. In many ways, Afghanistan was kind of the poster child for popularity of the United States in a Muslim country, given the United States' success in removing the widely disliked Taliban from power in Afghanistan. But that brought with it very high levels of expectations among the Afghan population for improvements in their personal and daily lives in terms of infrastructure, economic opportunities, security, and all the rest. And when those weren't realized over the years, we saw a dramatic decline in positive ratings for the United States and its efforts in that country. Now, we've seen in our most recent data a turnaround, and a fairly sharp turnaround, in some basic attitudes in terms of hopes for the future. A few elements inform that. The peaceful outcome of the election in Afghanistan, the commitment by Barack Obama to the United States sending further forces to Afghanistan where their presence, if not their performance, are appreciated, the provision of aid and development efforts in Afghanistan where we see increased road building and provision of health services and the rest. All these have contributed to another upturn in public hopes for the future. The question is whether those can be sustained in the face of the remaining challenges in terms of security, infrastructure, and the many other challenges still facing that country.
One of the numbers that you mentioned that I thought was most interesting was that the Taliban is extremely unpopular throughout the country at large, but when you look at specific areas like Kandahar, you see much greater support for the Taliban in the area. You also noted that civilian casualties are sort of very strongly linked to opinions about things like direction of the country. Do you think it's that the data in these particular high-level, high-conflict zone areas like Kandahar really do reflect the need for the U.S. to minimize civilian casualties in order to win hearts and minds?
I think the data overall, not just from Kandahar and Helmand, suggests that. Some of what was presented showed very clearly that over time, the greater the problem with civilian casualties, the less optimistic people were, the less they supported the government, the less they supported the U.S. troops. So I think it's a factor across the whole country, and in particular with Helmand and with Kandahar, if there are going to be people who are harmed in these operations, it's going to affect their outlook. And so the more civilian casualties can be limited, I think we'll see that reflected in public opinion. We've seen that trend in the last 5 years of data with ABC News. We see it in other research that we do. I think the poll we did with ABC News in December 2009, we got back up to that plateau again where people were starting to feel optimistic, but they wanted to see what would happen. And our continued polling into April of 2010, we can see those trends coming down again. We can see people feeling more pessimistic about the future. We see them more concerned about civilian casualties. And Gary showed data from the UN that in the first quarter, civilian casualties doubled in comparison to last year. So it's a huge issue for people. And fulfilling promises, lots of promises were made during that election. And if they're not fulfilled, I think we'll see people's opinions start to trend down as a result.
Yeah, I would underscore that I think the single most compelling piece of data that we've found in our surveys has been to show the corrosive effect of civilian casualties on public support in Afghanistan for the mission of the United States and its NATO allies. It's perhaps, apart from regional differences, the single strongest predictor of support for the presence and performance of the United States and the ISAF forces. It really is a central element. That seems to have been heard by the ISAF commander, General McChrystal, has put a very substantial focus on the reduction of civilian casualties. We can see clearly in our data how essential that is.
Final question, sort of on an uplifting note. I noticed that I believe it was 13 or 14% of respondents said that they had refrigerators, but I believe it was 60% that said they had cell phone access. What do you think that tells us about sort of the future of communication in Afghanistan and sort of the evolution of that society?
I think communication's only going to get better. Cell phones is one very strong example. The proliferation of media in general is incredible. During the Taliban, there was no television to speak of. Now there are dozens of television stations. There's all kinds of programming. There are things that are coming in, entertainment, things that are being dubbed over. There's lots coming into the country. The more people are exposed to, the more they can interact with one another, I think the more that we'll see change in Afghanistan. Communication usually breeds change, and there'll be a lot more in Afghanistan in the coming years.
It's interesting that we saw similar results in Iraq, an absolute explosion in the availability of household-level cell phones and in other infrastructure making it possible for communication to come to the people. Whatever the challenges in both of these countries, Iraq and Afghanistan, the opportunity to encounter new and different ideas and to engage in discourse have dramatically changed in both these countries, and that can only have an impact on their future.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.